I mentioned earlier that the war in Afghanistan really hasn't become a huge issue so far in the run-up to the British election, which has to be held by June next year. My first guest is Dr. Michael Williams. Although young, an Afghan expert and international relations lecturer at the Royal Holloway University in London. He's also given advice, I understand, to President Barack Obama. I hope it's not your advice he's following, Michael, because he's getting deeper and deeper into trouble, don't you think?
Well, during the campaign, this was one of the major issues the president faced, essentially trying to chart out where he wanted to go. And he chose to focus on the Afghan war as opposed to the Iraq war, saying the Afghan war was the good war. And I can say that one of the interesting debates among scholars in the field and amongst people working on the campaign was exactly sort of what avenue should he take. Should he invest more in the conflict? Should he send more troops? Or should he find more civilian methods to secure the population and develop the economy? And so that's what he's debating right now, which is why I think you see some hesitation coming from Washington.
He could have chosen, of course, to get out of both wars, because neither, in my view, is a good war, certainly not going to have a good outcome. And aren't people paying a very high price for the president's need in the election campaign to show that whilst, quote-unquote, soft on Iraq, he was prepared to be hard on Afghanistan? It's a bit cynical, isn't it?
Well, I think in the U.S., at least, the sentiment is that the Afghanistan war was a legitimate war because of 9/11. And particularly on the left side of the political spectrum, there's a hope that by, somewhat paradoxically in many ways, using military force coupled with civilian assistance, that you could develop Afghanistan in a way that will make it, in the long term, more stable, more secure, thereby helping Afghanistan. Of course, not being entirely altruistic, because the argument is it helps the United States and our allies to maintain security, to prevent it from being a terrorist safe haven. Of course, it is paradoxical in the sense that you're trying to use military force to develop a country in a manner that might be too quick and it takes time, and so you result in high civilian casualties, particularly because there have been too few forces on the ground, and this has resorted, sort of resolution of using bombs and aircraft where you really need more troops to sort of secure the population, and that's something that most political leaders aren't really willing to invest in.
I can assure you there's no danger of Afghanistan developing too fast. People are dying like flies. British soldiers, American soldiers, Canadians, recently Italians, and of course uncounted numbers of Afghans. You're too young to remember, but we've been across this before in my lifetime. The then USSR tried exactly this, military force and development hand in hand, and they suffered such a defeat that it in the end helped to bring the whole system down. Neither of us can remember, but Britain sent 3 armies there before and left their bones on the plains and the mountains of Afghanistan. This has doomed this war. What I'm puzzled by is why it's not so big an issue in Britain. You're a US man, but you're living and teaching in Britain. Why do you think the Afghan war doesn't have the political traction that the Iraq war had?
Well, 2 things. First, I think a lot of the public don't necessarily see it as doomed, per se. Afghanistan is certainly difficult territory, but there are some major differences. When Britain was there in the 1800s, it was for imperial conquest. When the Soviets went in, they were forcing a system onto a vast majority of the public who didn't really want communism. They had collectivization of farms, they were promoting women's rights at an incredibly fast scale, although it was in some ways very good from a liberal point of view, not very good for indigenous Afghan society. The West has tried and generally been successful in not imposing too many values onto Afghanistan, and that's a fine line there. It's been at times, I think, questionable. But the Afghans, generally the population, do not feel as if they're being forced to pursue a path they don't want. The majority of Afghans actually are rather supportive of the international force there. It's a smaller minority, particularly from the south, that are opposed to this. But that said, I think the reason it hasn't gained electoral traction is again because of the consternation with the Bush administration really going in. Iraq was patently illegitimate. There's really no way about it. They used a variety of sort of lies and half-truths to legitimate a war that didn't make much sense from a strategic point of view, never mind an ethical and moral point of view. In the case of Afghanistan, the public has by and large supported the idea that after 9/11, the U.S. should have done something, that they had a right to go into Afghanistan. I think what we're seeing now, though, is people questioning how accurate that strategy was. Did we need to invade the country? Do we need to sort of pursuing the military campaign that we are to make it a better country? Could we have done it differently? The problem is, of course, the course was set by the Bush administration. and sort of left on autopilot with very little attention. So Obama is trying to make the best of a bad situation. I don't think the president is too keen on investing large amounts of military assets in a way that would make things worse for the Afghans, nor for American or allied forces, but at the same time he has to figure out a way to stabilize the situation enough to get out of the country without losing face and ultimately without leaving it worse off. And the track record right now is quite mixed.
Indeed. We have legitimate interests in Afghanistan, and you above all, as an American. Our legitimate interest is that it is not a haven, a base for international terrorism. I would argue we have no other legitimate interest in it. It's not our business who runs Afghanistan, what their policy is, as long as it doesn't affect its neighbours and affect us. Therefore, why don't we concentrate on dividing, separating into what is, I think, a proper dichotomy: the Taliban and Afghan resistance and the international terrorists of Al-Qaeda. You're an intelligent man. You know these are not the same things, though they have become conflated in international propaganda terms. Al-Qaeda's leaders are almost certainly no longer in Afghanistan. Indeed, they're probably in Pakistan, where our strategy, our joint strategy, has begun destabilizing an even more strategically important country in Pakistan across the border.
No, it's a very astute observation. Over the last 8 years, the Bush administration essentially conflated sort of Afghan-based groups that are leading an insurgency and al-Qaeda groups. And the Obama team has started to pick apart at that. Now, in the U.S. media, from the right wing, you still get sort of this whole idea of the war on terror and terrorists. But from the left, you certainly see much more of a differentiation between the actors, which is why you see General McChrystal and others talking about the possibility that the Afghan government would engage politically with these different actors. And I think there's certainly a basis for that. If you look at Northern Ireland, you cannot resolve a conflict with people that you refuse to talk to. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Doesn't mean that it legitimates killing civilians and blowing yourself up in marketplaces, but at the same time, you have to address political grievances within a space and say, this is what the acceptable space is. Let's talk and find a solution. I think that Afghanistan isn't headed in that direction, and certainly the U.S. and its allies want to see the Afghans probably stepping up more in terms of providing their own security, and I think that will involve talking to the Taliban and other Afghan forces. At the same time, you need to look at the problems in Pakistan, where essentially the Bush strategy pushed the insurgency al-Qaeda forces into Pakistan, where they've basically been hibernating and using Pakistan as a base to launch attacks into Afghanistan and against the government in Islamabad. And so right now, really, there needs to be a focus on stabilizing Pakistan, which relates to India then, encouraging rapprochement between India and Pakistan, which is, again, political discussions. What you really need here is confidence building and trust, not more weapons.
How effective is the right-wing attack on President Obama? From here, it looks like he's in quite deep water now. The Fox News extreme right attack on him seems to have picked up a lot of traction very quickly.
Well, domestically, the president is having a hard time. In terms of domestic legislation, his proposed health care reforms to provide sort of progressive care across the country to everyone has really been bogged down and has become particularly a point of attack and erroneous attacks. So the idea of death panels, that if you turn a certain age, you're going to be killed by the government.
Yes.
Exactly. And that everyone will be forced to have socialized medicine, which will never happen in the U.S. because the system is just evolved differently. The idea is to provide responsible health care to everyone, not relying on the use of emergency rooms, which is incredibly ineffective, both financially and in terms of healthcare provisions.
The wallet biopsy, I saw it described on The Sopranos as.
Yes.
But his foreign policy is also under attack, isn't it?
Well, exactly, and this is always a problem for Democrats. Democrats are traditionally seen as the mommy party. We're seen as the weak party, and so this is a bit dangerous because sometimes Democratic presidents, in an effort to prove themselves, can go in the wrong direction. We saw that in Vietnam, and then of course after Vietnam you saw a drastic pullback from the use of force, which resulted in part of the birth of the neoconservative movement, who had disaffected liberals who thought the U.S. should use force to bring democracy to the world. But Obama, in terms of his policy in Afghanistan right now, is certainly taking some heat. He's being called a bit weak. They say he's equivocating. I think at the moment he's really thinking about his options. He doesn't want to take a wrong step. He's very cognizant of Vietnam, where every time the general said, send us more forces, people did, and that didn't result in anything very good at all. And so at the moment he's really trying to shore up his rear guard while providing a policy that's best for the U.S., for Afghanistan, and the wider region.
Dr. Michael Williams, told you he was a smart guy.